the divine advanced practice registered nurse, the divine ambulatory care nurse, the divine business nurse, the divine bariatric nurse, the divine camp nurse, the divine cardiac care nurse, the divine cardiac cath lab nurse, the divine case management nurse, the divine clinical nurse leader, the divine clinical nurse specialist, the divine community health nurse, the divine complementary health nurse, the divine correctional facility nurse, the divine critical care nurse, the divine dermatology nurse, the divine developmental disability nurse, the divine diabetes nurse, the divine dialysis nurse, the divine domestic violence nurse, the divine emergency nurse, the divine ethics nurse, the divine family nurse practitioner, the divine flight/transport nurse, the divine forensic nurse, the divine gastroenterology nurse, the divine genetics nurse, the divine geriatric nurse, the divine gerontological nurse practitioner, the divine gynecology/obstetric nurse, the divine health policy nurse, the divine hematology nurse, the divine HIV/AIDS nurse, the divine holistic nurse, the divine home healthcare nurse, the divine hospice/palliative nurse, the divine independent nurse contractor, the divine infection control nurse, the divine informatics nurse, the divine infusion nurse, the divine international nurse, the divine labor and delivery nurse, the divine lactation consultation nurse, the divine legal nurse consultant, the divine licensed practical nurse, the divine long-term care nurse, the divine managed care nurse, the divine medical surgical nurse, the divine military and uniformed service nurse, the divine missionary nurse, the divine neonatal intensive care nurse, the divine nephrology nurse, the divine neuroscience nurse, the divine nurse anesthetist, the divine nurse attorney, the divine nurse educator, the divine nurse legislator, the divine life care planning nurse, the divine nurse midwife, the divine nurse practitioner, the divine nurse researcher, the divine advocacy nurse, the divine nurse entrepreneur, the divine nursing executive and nursing CEO, the divine nurse manager and nurse administration specialist, the divine quality improvement nurse, the divine nurse writer, author, or historian, the divine occupational health nurse, the divine oncology nurse, cancer nurse, the divine operating room nurse, perioperative nurse, the divine ophthalmic nurse, the divine orthopedic nurse, the divine otorhinolaryngology nurse, head and neck nurse, the divine overseas, volunteer, missionary, or refugee nurse, the divine pain management nurse, the divine parish nurse, the divine pediatric endocrinology nurse, the divine pediatric nurse practitioner, the divine pediatric nurse, the divine para-anesthesia nurse, pre-anesthesia and post-anesthesia nurse, the divine perinatal nurse, the divine plastic surgery nurse, the divine poison information specialist, the divine psychiatric nurse practitioner, the divine psychiatric nurse, the divine public health nurse, the divine pulmonary care nurse, respiratory nurse, the divine radiology nurse, the divine registered nurse, RN, the divine rehabilitation nurse, the divine reproductive nurse, the divine rheumatology nurse, the divine sexual assault nurse examiner, the divine school nurse, the divine subacute nurse, the divine substance abuse nurse, the divine supplemental/agency nurse, the divine surgical nurse, the divine telemetry nurse, the divine telephone triage nurse, the divine toxicology nurse, the divine transcultural nurse,